So let's take a look at Dr. Lanyon. So Lanyon is Jekyll's scientific antithesis. An antithesis is someone or something that is the direct opposite of someone or something else. So in this case, Lanyon and Jekyll are very much opposites. They represent different things about science in Victorian England. So Lanyon and Jekyll do have some things in common. So they're upper class doctors, and they both have reputations to uphold. However, they differ on the type of science that they practice. Lanyon practices rational science like anatomy, and Jekyll practices science that is closer to the supernatural. So he makes potions and he thinks about sort of how he can change himself rather than just practicing something that was widely accepted at the time, like anatomy. So like a normal sort of medical doctor might. If you get a Lanyon question, I would always say compare him to Jekyll. We've just kind of gone over it. What's the purpose of Lanyon? What do we think about him? Comparing him to Jekyll is important because he is there to give us another way of looking at science. So they both handle knowledge in very different ways. And Jekyll allows that knowledge to corrupt him, and he chases his darkest desires. So he uses science for his own personal gain. Knowledge actually kills Lanyon because he's so shocked by the truth and the true nature of man and what we could do with science that he actually ends up dying because he cannot handle that. Jekyll believes Lanyon is a Hyde-bound pedant. So Hyde-bound means unwilling to change because of tradition, and a pedant is a person who is overly concerned with the rules. So we can see here where Lanyon is very traditional. He represents all of those sort of traditional Victorian beliefs, and specifically traditional Victorian beliefs about science and the bounds that we had to put on science. Whereas Jekyll believes in pushing those boundaries, in pushing those rules. So he is definitely not a pedant, but he describes Lanyon as one. Some key quotations from Lanyon. So if you were to get an essay about Lanyon, I would always use these quotations. He does say that Henry Jekyll is too fanciful for him. I would zoom in on that adjective fanciful, how it kind of makes everything seem like a bit of a fantasy. It makes Jekyll seem a bit strange, and it definitely makes Jekyll seem very unscientific, actually, like he's living in this sort of fantasy world. Then we've got the quotation scientific heresies. So heresies are things that go against God. So once again, we're aligning Lanyon with the religious aspect. Despite being a scientist, you know, he still has respect for those religious traditions of Victorian society. We have the quotation unscientific balderdash. So when he says this, balderdash very much means that it's nonsense. He also calls it unscientific because, again, it doesn't fit with his version of science and his way of looking at science. So he calls it unscientific because he doesn't actually believe that this is really science. So once again, we have this adjective that we could zoom in on with unscientific. The next quotation that we've got is, I have had a shock, he said, and I shall never recover. So I want you to look at Lanyon's death as symbolic. He does die because he can't accept change, which is why it's symbolic. It symbolizes the scientific community at the time, the fact that they were unable to accept change. And there were lots of scientific discoveries that were going on, tons of them. So we had the scientific discovery of evolution, and Charles Darwin wrote a book on it, and people did not accept that at the time. So this kind of idea that he dies is heavily symbolic, and it really does show that people were just very unwilling to change. Then we have the last quotation on here. I sometimes think if we knew all, we should be more glad to get away. This really does reflect his inability to change. The fact that he's happy to die. He's happy to leave this world behind because it doesn't fit with his beliefs, and his entire belief system has been shattered. So he doesn't see a problem with leaving. He doesn't see a problem with dying because he kind of just feels like he wants to. At this moment, he feels like everything has disappeared for him, that belief system, that core belief system that he had about science, and that's his life's work. So actually, his life's work's been taken away from him, so we can kind of see why he would be so upset by that. So lastly, we've got Lanyon's purpose. So Lanyon has a very specific purpose in this novella. Firstly, Lanyon's narrative gives another scientific perspective, which makes Jekyll seem less like a madman. Jekyll's actual perspective on the case, when you read it, sounds like it's not trustworthy. It does sound like he could be making a lot of it up. But Stevenson uses Lanyon's account to make it seem more trustworthy and thus increase the horror of everything. If it just seemed like Jekyll had gone mad, it wouldn't seem as bad. But the fact that we have Lanyon's narrative shows us that Jekyll hasn't gone mad and that actually Jekyll is telling the truth. So it makes it seem more scary. It adds to that horror, it adds to that tension. The next one is that Lanyon's narrative helps Utterson solve the case. So without Lanyon's narrative, again, nothing would have been completely answered because, again, we couldn't trust what Jekyll was saying, but with Lanyon's, we can trust it. Lanyon represents the normal scientific community who did not push the boundaries of religion too much, and they did not push the boundaries of science the way that Jekyll did. So he does represent the more traditional side of Victorian England, the more accepted side. He is therefore more trusted by the reader. So remember, the reader is not us in 2023. The reader is a Victorian because that's who Stevenson was writing for. So we do trust, as Victorian readers, we do trust Lanyon more because he is more traditional. Lanyon also represents an inability for science and society to change. So he would rather die than actually change. And that really does show that at the time society wasn't really ready to accept a lot of these scientific advancements.